Welcome back to AfricaCom TV, a wonderful series of interviews with some of the speakers and of course exhibitors here at AfricaCom and Africa Tech. And quite big at this year's AfricaCom is the conversation around how we accelerate the enterprise digital transformation of the African continent, which leads us quite nicely into the conversation we're going to have around how you invest in connectivity in the rural and underserviced areas of not only South Africa, but certainly of the African continent. And the gentleman to talk us through that is Premeshin Naidoo. Premeshin is the sector head for telecommunications, media and technology at ABSA Corporate and Investment Banking. Premeshin, lovely to have you here. Thank you for coming to join us.
Good morning to you, Africa, and thank you very much for having me here today.
Investing in any connectivity is very expensive. How do you attract investment in rural connectivity?
So I think rural connectivity poses a number of challenges, most notably the fact that it's that much more difficult to get the business case around rural connectivity to work. So for a mobile network operator to invest in rural infrastructure requires a significant amount of capital, right? Given the long distances, etc. And for them to get a return on that capital is quite a challenging feat, given the fact that the spending power of the rural population is not as high as the urban population. That's the first point. The second point is that the population density is much lower in a rural context than in an urban context. So it's almost a double whammy for the mobile network operator, right? So there's fewer people spending less. How do they then earn sufficient revenues, which ultimately drives the returns on that investment?
How does government help? Because ultimately, the government of any country will want all of its citizens to have access to good connectivity and data and all that kind of information. Is there any room for conversation between those with investment and money and looking to make money and what government can do to make that business case easier for them?
Yes, absolutely. I think, first and foremost, and maybe this is slightly contentious, I do not see the role of government as being the developer of the infrastructure. So for government to roll out the infrastructure and to become a telco operator, in my mind, I don't think it necessarily works. You cannot be the regulator and a player at the same time because that's an inherent conflict. I think what government's role should be is to ensure that they drive the right policy that actually promotes investment in a rural context. And secondly, what government can do is also create the necessary incentives to encourage investment, right? So across policy and incentives, government can actually be very effective in terms of rolling out connectivity to rural populations.
What are the multiplier effects then when it comes to rural connectivity?
Well, I think it goes without saying, first and foremost, in an African context, not just in South Africa, but across the continent, we know that education is a problem, right? Or access to education is a problem. Now, can you imagine a scenario where there's ubiquitous broadband connectivity available at low cost? And what does that do in terms of empowering the African child, right? In terms of access to education and educational materials, access to thinking in a global context. Just think about what we get to see on YouTube as a very good example, and how enlightening that could be in terms of opening their perspectives to what's going on in the global economy, right? And imagine for a moment the creativity that could inspire in the African child who's in a rural context to see what's happening on the global stage. I think the extent of that empowerment is only limited to one's imagination, right? Apart from that, I think from a commercial perspective, consider the opportunities to develop new commercial enterprises that are suited for a rural context. And I come back to the point around, we could develop solutions that are unique to Africa, which then could be rolled out into a global context. And M-Pesa and the success of M-Pesa is probably a very good case in point.
What about pooling of resources? So the I suppose mobile network operators, the people who are rolling out connectivity, saying, I'll take 10 Rand from you, I'll take $10 from you, I'll take €10 from you. We pull our resources, create the infrastructure that we all draw benefit from. Is that an idea that could be explored?
Absolutely. In fact, I was thinking around a similar concept, right? So firstly, there's obligations on mobile network operators to ensure some level of universal connectivity, okay, and to roll out, for example, infrastructure into rural areas. The problem with that approach is that for each operator to do so on their own does not necessarily mean that it's economically feasible to do it, okay? And one of the arguments that I've put forward is that there needs to be collaboration in the industry. So what may not be a feasible investment for one operator to make by themselves may become feasible if there's 2 or 3 or 4 operators who collectively fund the rollout of infrastructure to rural areas. And without meaning to get too technical, I think you've got passive infrastructure and you've got the active network, right? And in terms of active network sharing, that is certainly something that we need to drive in the industry. So there's already a fairly substantial amount of passive infrastructure sharing, but active network sharing, as we've seen in South Africa and elsewhere across the continent, is only in its infancy. And I think it needs to be encouraged by the regulator, and I think more importantly, I think the regulator needs to amend the regulations to allow things like spectrum sharing.
Because geography is a wonderful, wonderful challenge for us on the African continent, right? Where you've got people concentrated in Cape Town, in Johannesburg, in Lagos, in Nairobi, and of course the network there and the infrastructure is going to be rolled out. But somebody in Kimberley or some far-flung provinces of Nigeria or Senegal, it does get a bit expensive to roll out the technology there.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got this massive geographic areas which need to be covered, right? And the question is, what enables you to provide connectivity? And it brings me to a further point around, how do we solution for connectivity in a rural context? So firstly, it's not a uniquely African problem, right? So this problem of rural connectivity exists in the UK, it exists in the US, right? Because of the point that you don't have dense populations. In the developed markets, spending power is not necessarily an issue, because you have, for example, farmers or farming communities who have relatively high disposable incomes in developed markets. In an African context, you don't necessarily have that, right? So it goes back to my earlier point around low population densities, low spending power. So how do you solution for that? And I think that's where technology actually has an incredibly important role to play, right? And I think technologically driven solutions can potentially be the game changer. And where do we get that technology from? Do we wait for China or Europe or the Americas to develop that technology, or do we develop it in an African context? And specifically the solutioning around that technology. So we've seen things like the Google Loon project, which has been fairly successful. There's various trials and commercial rollouts for low orbit satellites, which can help to solution the problem. But furthermore, do we need actual mobile connectivity? So do we need the entire area to be covered, or could we create hotspots, for example, right? So fixed wireless type solutions in a rural village. Okay, so you might have to walk up to a point to download the content that you want, but you're comparing that against zero connectivity. So I think using technology and using it in a fairly clever manner allows you to actually solution the requirement in a way that becomes economically feasible.
And are the players having that conversation, or are they waiting for permission from ABSA to come and say, Guy, why don't you chat to that guy and see how we can work together and collaborate so that we can, I suppose, spread the pain and the burden of the infrastructure cost?
So I think that's an interesting point, right? So I think all of the operators are thinking about it, okay, because certainly across the continent, as low as the spending power may be, as low as the population densities may be, it's an additional source of revenue to the operators. So I think the operators are actively thinking about how to solution it. The question is, how do you finance it, and how do you make your investors happy with the returns that you will get from this, right? So, if you look at certain initiatives from, for example, Google and Facebook, they're not necessarily the commercial imperative behind it is not necessarily apparent. So we know that there's substantial advertising revenues, for example, that Google and Facebook can earn. But this is not going to be realized in the next 3 years. This is a 5 to 10 year story. And I think that is really the crux of it. It's to convince mobile network operators to invest for the long term, that the value creation for them is over a period of time rather than in a 3 or a 5 year time horizon.
And that's why you earn the big bucks. Thank you very much, Premeshin Naidoo, Sector Head for Telecommunications, Media and Technology at ABSA Corporate and Investment Banking. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.